Sir, step away from the rail. This party isn't for you. The sentence cut across the upper deck of the yacht like a snapped rope, sharp enough that several nearby guests stopped mid-conversation and slowly turned their heads toward the source. The music was still playing, soft jazz drifting across Biscayne Bay, but the mood had shifted in an instant. Standing near the polished chrome railing was a tall black man in his early 40s wearing a simple navy polo, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Nothing flashy. No watch sparkling under the deck lights. No entourage. Just quiet confidence and the calm posture of someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything. His name was Marcus Ellington, though no one on that deck seemed to recognize it yet. In front of him stood Chloe Whitman, the event hostess, clipboard tucked under one arm, expression tight with the kind of forced smile that didn't reach the eyes. She had spent the evening greeting guests stepping aboard the 80-foot yacht floating just off the Miami marina, checking names, handing out champagne flutes, and directing people toward the glowing lounge area on the upper deck. It had been a picture-perfect summer evening, 78 degrees with a warm ocean breeze sliding over the water, city lights shimmering behind the harbor like scattered diamonds. But now that perfect image had cracked. I said this event is private, Chloe repeated, louder this time, as if volume alone could confirm authority. Conversations around them faded into whispers. A man in a white blazer lowered his drink. A woman near the bar subtly raised her phone, curiosity already pulling her toward the moment. Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply looked out across the water, the dark Atlantic stretching past the marina lights toward the horizon. The wind moved gently across the deck, carrying the faint scent of salt and engine oil from nearby boats. Then he turned back toward Chloe with an expression so calm it almost made the tension around them feel louder. I heard you, he said quietly. That should have been the end of it. Most people would have stepped away or tried to explain themselves quickly, eager to smooth over an awkward misunderstanding in front of wealthy strangers. But Marcus didn't move. He stood exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly against the cool metal railing, eyes steady. And that stillness made Chloe uneasy. She glanced quickly around the deck, noticing the attention gathering like storm clouds. This yacht party was meant to impress investors, tech founders, and local business elites. The host, Daniel Crawford, had spent weeks organizing it. A scene like this was not part of the plan. Look, Chloe said, lowering her voice but tightening her tone. If you came with someone, they should have checked you in downstairs. Otherwise, you need to leave the vessel. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Leave? The word hung there for a second, not angry, just curious. Chloe nodded once, the practiced politeness slipping further from her voice. Yes, leave. Nearby, a tall man with sandy hair whispered to his friend, What's going on? The friend shrugged, already opening the camera app on his phone. A few feet away, another guest murmured, Did he sneak in or something? The whispers spread quickly. That was the strange thing about elite spaces like this. Silence could hold for hours, but the moment something unusual appeared, attention moved fast. Within seconds, a loose half-circle of onlookers had formed, pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. Marcus noticed it too. Not the phones yet, not the murmurs, just the subtle shift in the air. The way people leaned closer when they sensed a story about to unfold. He had seen that look before. Many times. Chloe tapped the clipboard against her palm. Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Marcus glanced briefly at the yacht's sleek white interior, the glowing deck lights, the small stage where a saxophone player continued performing as if nothing unusual was happening. Then he looked back at her. Interesting, he said. Chloe frowned. What is? Marcus's eyes moved slowly across the crowd gathering around them. The assumption. The word sounded almost reflective, like someone studying a puzzle rather than arguing with it. Chloe's patience snapped another inch shorter. This isn't about assumptions, she replied. It's about guest access. She gestured toward the gangway leading back toward the marina dock nearly 30 yards away. Two security staff members stood near the entrance, their attention slowly shifting toward the tension building above them. So you'll need to head down there, she continued. Now. The wind lifted a strand of her blonde hair as she spoke. Marcus followed her gesture with his eyes, looking toward the dock lights glowing in the distance. For a moment he didn't say anything, and that pause made the entire deck lean forward without realizing it. You know, Marcus said finally, it's funny. Chloe crossed her arms. What's funny? How confident people can be about something they haven't checked. That earned a small ripple of murmurs from the surrounding guests. Chloe's jaw tightened. Sir, this is your last warning. The music continued playing behind them, but the saxophone now sounded oddly distant, like background noise to a scene that had suddenly become the main event. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, still calm. Before we go any further, he said, can I ask a question? Chloe exhaled through her nose. What? Marcus gestured toward the yacht around them. Who owns this boat? The question caught her off guard. She blinked once. That's not relevant. Maybe not, Marcus replied gently. But I'm curious. Someone in the crowd chuckled quietly. Another guest whispered, this guy's bold. Chloe took a step closer, lowering her voice again, but failing to hide the irritation underneath it. Daniel Crawford owns this vessel tonight, she said, and he invited a very specific guest list. Marcus nodded slowly. I see. The crowd waited. Chloe waited. The ocean breeze moved across the deck again, fluttering the edge of a linen tablecloth near the bar. And you're certain, Marcus asked, that I'm not on it? Chloe didn't hesitate. Positive. That was when a young woman near the staircase lifted her phone a little higher, the camera clearly recording now. Marcus noticed the small red recording light. He didn't react. Instead, he looked back toward Chloe with the same calm expression he had worn since the moment she approached him. All right, he said quietly. Let's take a second then. Chloe stared at him. For what? Marcus slipped one hand into his pocket and slowly pulled out his phone. For clarity. The word landed softly, but the effect rippled through the deck like a sudden drop in pressure. Phones lifted. Conversation stopped entirely. Even the saxophone player on stage seemed to glance over mid-note. Chloe watched him unlock the screen with a small flick of his thumb. What are you doing? She demanded. Marcus looked up briefly, meeting her eyes. Making sure we're all talking about the same yacht. For the first time since the confrontation began, Chloe felt a flicker of uncertainty slide through her confidence. Just a flicker. But it was enough that the guests closest to her noticed. And somewhere behind the growing circle of spectators, a voice whispered quietly, Wait, who is that guy? The answer was coming. And when Marcus Ellington finally spoke again, the calm in his voice would turn the entire deck silent. The wind shifted across the upper deck as Marcus Ellington lowered his phone slightly, the screen glowing faintly under the warm deck lights, while the quiet hum of the marina wrapped around the yacht like a soft echo. The circle of guests watching had grown larger without anyone formally stepping forward. They simply drifted closer one by one, drawn by the gravity of a moment that clearly was not finished yet. Chloe Whitman noticed the shift immediately. What had started as a simple removal of someone she believed did not belong had suddenly become something else entirely. Conversations were no longer happening behind her. Every nearby guest was watching. The music still floated through the speakers, but the saxophone player had softened his tone, instinctively lowering the volume as if the deck itself had become a stage. Marcus remained calm, holding his phone with the same relaxed posture as before, the kind of stillness that unsettled people who expected tension or anger. Chloe folded her arms again, attempting to reclaim the authority she had been certain of only moments earlier. Sir, she said firmly, recording a scene is not going to change the guest list. Marcus glanced down at his phone and then back at her. I am not recording, he said. I am confirming. A quiet ripple of whispers moved through the guests behind Chloe. One man leaned closer to another and murmured that the situation felt strange. Another guest whispered that the man did not look nervous at all. That detail alone began to chip away at Chloe's confidence. People who sneak into private yacht parties usually react very differently when confronted. They apologize, explain themselves, or try to leave quickly before attention grows. Marcus Ellington did none of those things. He simply stood there with quiet patience. Chloe took another step forward, lowering her voice so that only the closest people could hear her words clearly. This is not necessary, she said. If you were invited, your name would already be on my list. Marcus nodded slightly, almost thoughtfully. Lists are interesting things, he replied. Sometimes they say more about the person holding them than the people missing from them. That comment landed in the air like a slow drop of ink spreading through water. The nearby guests exchanged glances. Chloe's jaw tightened again. She glanced briefly toward the gangway where the two security staff members had now turned fully toward the scene unfolding above them. They were not moving yet, but they were watching carefully. She wanted this resolved quickly before it became embarrassing for the host. "Let me make this clear," Chloe said, returning her attention to Marcus. "This event is private and invitation only. The host personally approved every name. If you cannot produce that invitation, then you need to leave the vessel." Marcus lifted his phone slightly, the glow reflecting faintly in his eyes. "And if the host made a mistake?" Chloe laughed softly, though the sound carried more irritation than humor. "Daniel Crawford does not make mistakes about his guest list." At the mention of the host's name, several people in the crowd nodded subtly. Daniel Crawford was well known in the local tech and venture capital scene. His yacht parties were famous for bringing together founders, investors, and entrepreneurs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Invitations were limited and highly controlled. The implication was simple. Someone like Marcus, dressed plainly and standing alone, did not match the expected image of that crowd. Marcus seemed to notice the shift in attitude around him. Not hostile exactly, but skeptical, curious, waiting to see whether Chloe was right. He looked down at his phone again and tapped the screen once. The motion was small but deliberate. A second later, the faint vibration of the device echoed through his hand. Chloe watched him carefully. "Are you calling someone?" she asked. "Something like that," Marcus replied. A few feet away, a young man wearing a light blue blazer whispered quietly into his phone camera while continuing to film. He told his viewers that something unusual was happening on the upper deck of the Crawford yacht. The number of people recording the moment had quietly doubled. Phones were angled from multiple directions now, capturing Marcus, Chloe, and the growing tension between them. Marcus seemed completely unbothered by it. He slipped the phone briefly to his ear and spoke in a tone that was calm and professional. "Good evening, Evelyn," he said. The name meant nothing to anyone listening, but the way he said it sounded practiced, like the start of a routine conversation. Chloe rolled her eyes slightly, though she remained attentive. Marcus continued speaking quietly. "Yes, I am at the marina. Dock 17. I believe there might be a small confusion about the yacht." He paused as if listening carefully. The crowd leaned closer. Chloe tapped her clipboard impatiently. "Sir, you cannot remain here indefinitely." Marcus held up one finger politely without breaking the call. "Give me a moment." The simple gesture irritated Chloe more than anything else that had happened so far. Being dismissed, even briefly, in front of an audience of wealthy guests was not part of her job description. She straightened her posture and waited, her expression tightening as the seconds passed. Marcus nodded once as the voice on the other end of the call spoke. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is the one." Another pause followed. Then Marcus glanced up toward the yacht's upper mast where a small digital display panel glowed with the vessel's name illuminated in white letters. The crowd noticed the glance, and several people turned their heads to look as well. Marcus smiled faintly and spoke again into the phone. "I thought so." When he lowered the phone from his ear, the deck had become completely silent. Even the music had stopped. Somewhere below, the soft hum of the yacht's engines idling at the dock was the only sound left. Chloe shifted uncomfortably. "Well?" she demanded. Marcus slid the phone back into his pocket slowly. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding," he said calmly. Chloe lifted the clipboard again as if ready to end the discussion once and for all. "No," she replied firmly. "There has not been." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You are certain?" "Completely," Chloe said. Marcus studied her for a moment longer, not with anger, but with the quiet patience of someone watching a puzzle piece fall into place. Around them the guests waited in complete silence now. No one wanted to miss what came next. The ocean breeze drifted across the deck again, fluttering the small flags near the bow of the yacht. Marcus finally looked back toward Chloe and spoke with a tone so calm it almost sounded conversational. "That is interesting," he said. Chloe frowned. "What is?" Marcus gestured lightly toward the yacht around them, the polished wood deck. The glowing lights reflecting across the water, and the silent circle of onlookers now watching every movement. "Because according to the company registry," Marcus continued, "this vessel belongs to Ellington Ventures." The name landed like a spark in dry grass. A few people in the crowd immediately recognized it. Someone whispered it out loud before realizing they had spoken. "Ellington Ventures?" Another guest turned toward Marcus with sudden interest. Chloe's expression shifted for the first time that evening. Not panic. Not yet. But uncertainty. That is impossible, she said quickly. Marcus simply looked at her. The calm in his eyes had not changed at all. And in that moment, the entire deck realized that the quiet man they had all been watching might not be a stranger after all. For several seconds after Marcus Ellington spoke those words, the entire deck remained completely silent, the kind of silence that does not come from calm, but from confusion. The ocean breeze drifted across the yacht again, rustling the small white flags near the bow while the lights of the Miami skyline shimmered across the dark water behind them. Chloe Whitman did not move at first. She stood exactly where she had been, clipboard still in her hand, staring at Marcus as if she had just heard something that did not belong in reality. Around her the guests began exchanging quick glances, and the quiet whispers returned, louder this time, carrying one name repeatedly through the circle. Ellington Ventures. Several people in the crowd clearly recognized it. One man in a gray blazer lowered his glass slowly and whispered to the woman beside him that Ellington Ventures owned a large percentage of the marina development across the harbor. Another guest murmured that the company had recently acquired several luxury vessels for private charter operations along the East Coast. Chloe heard the murmurs but tried to ignore them. Her instincts told her that the situation was shifting in a direction she had not expected, and the only way to stop it was to hold her ground with confidence. She lifted her chin slightly and forced a small laugh that sounded rehearsed rather than natural. That company has nothing to do with this yacht, she said firmly. Marcus did not react to the dismissal. He simply looked at her with the same quiet expression that had unsettled her from the beginning. The calm in. His posture seemed to grow heavier with every second. One of the security staff members near the gangway took a cautious step closer to the group, but stopped when he noticed the growing crowd of guests forming around the scene. No one wanted to intervene too quickly when wealthy investors and influential entrepreneurs were watching closely. Chloe tapped the clipboard again, trying to regain the rhythm of authority that had guided her through dozens of similar events. "Sir, I am going to ask you one final time to leave the vessel," she said, projecting her voice clearly so that everyone nearby could hear. Marcus glanced briefly toward the harbor, then back at Chloe. "You are very confident," he replied quietly. "Confidence is part of my job," Chloe answered. Marcus nodded slowly. So is verification. A few guests near the bar exchanged small smiles at that response. The atmosphere had shifted again, not entirely in Marcus's favor yet, but enough that Chloe could feel control slipping from the edges of the moment. She quickly flipped through the pages on her clipboard, scanning the printed guest list as if the answer she wanted might suddenly appear there. Names of investors, startup founders, venture partners, and media executives filled the sheet. Marcus Ellington was not among them. She turned the clipboard around and held it up slightly. "Your name is not here," she said. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying the page from several feet away. "That list was printed this afternoon, correct?" Chloe frowned. "Yes." "Then it might be outdated," Marcus said calmly. The comment produced another ripple of quiet murmurs. Chloe closed the clipboard sharply. "No," she replied. "It is not outdated." Marcus folded his hands lightly in front of him, maintaining the relaxed posture that had become almost impossible to ignore. The crowd continued watching, phones still raised, recording every word. One guest whispered that the situation felt like a business negotiation rather than an argument. Another guest quietly said that the man being confronted did not look like someone who was uncertain about his position. Chloe turned her attention toward the security staff member who had stepped closer. "Michael," she said, keeping her voice firm but controlled, "please escort this gentleman back to the dock." The security guard hesitated for a moment. He glanced at Marcus, then at the surrounding guests, then back at Chloe. The hesitation was small, but noticeable. Marcus noticed it too. He offered the guard a polite nod, acknowledging the awkwardness of the situation without saying a word. That brief exchange only deepened the uncertainty spreading across the deck. Chloe felt it immediately and tried to push past it. "This is a private event," she repeated. "We cannot have unregistered individuals remaining on board." Marcus finally moved one step forward, not aggressively but deliberately, closing the distance between them by less than 2 feet. The movement caused several guests to lean forward instinctively, eager to hear what he would say next. Marcus spoke quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the silent deck. "May I ask you a question, Chloe?" The sound of her name made her blink in surprise. "How do you know my name?" she asked quickly. Marcus gestured toward the badge clipped neatly to the edge of her clipboard. "It is written right there." A few guests chuckled softly. Chloe felt a brief flush of embarrassment, but pushed past it. "That is not the point," she said sharply. "The point is that you are not on the guest list." Marcus considered her words for a moment. "Then perhaps the guest list should be updated." Chloe shook her head. "That is not how these events work." Marcus looked toward the upper deck again where the yacht's illuminated name panel glowed softly against the night sky. "Actually," he said calmly, "that is exactly how ownership works." The word ownership landed with unusual weight. Several guests shifted their stance immediately. One woman lowered her phone and whispered that the conversation had just taken a very different direction. Chloe felt the shift again, stronger this time. "You keep implying something," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "If you have something to say it clearly." Marcus studied her expression for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing each word with deliberate care. "Ellington Ventures acquired majority operating control of this vessel 3 weeks ago." The sentence moved through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Several guests turned toward each other instantly, recognition flashing across their faces. One investor near the back whispered that he had read something about that acquisition in a financial newsletter. Another guest said the deal had been part of a larger marina redevelopment partnership earlier that month. Chloe felt her confidence slip again, this time enough that she could not completely hide it. "That cannot be correct," she said. Marcus offered a small, patient smile. "It is." Chloe glanced toward the gangway again, where the security staff member now looked thoroughly uncertain about how to proceed. The tension on the deck had reached a point where any wrong move could quickly turn into embarrassment for the host of the event. "Even if that were true," Chloe said carefully, "that does not mean you are involved with the company." Marcus raised one eyebrow slightly. "Fair point." The crowd leaned closer again. Marcus reached into his pocket and slowly removed his phone once more. The small glow of the screen illuminated his face as he unlocked it with a smooth motion. He tapped once and turned the phone slightly toward Chloe so that she could see the display. At first she did not move. Then curiosity overcame hesitation, and she stepped closer to glance at the screen. Her eyes moved quickly across the text displayed there. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had happened earlier. Chloe straightened slowly, her expression shifting from irritation to something far less certain. "What is that?" she asked. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket calmly. "Corporate registration confirmation," he said. Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when a voice suddenly called out from behind the crowd. "Is that Marcus Ellington?" Every head on the deck turned toward the source of the question. A man in a charcoal suit was stepping forward through the guests, his expression suddenly alert. The circle parted slightly to let him through. Marcus looked at the man and offered a small nod of recognition. The man stopped a few feet away and stared for a moment before speaking again. "It is him," he said quietly. The murmurs across the deck multiplied instantly. Chloe looked from the man to Marcus and back again, realizing that the quiet stranger she had confronted might not have been a stranger at all. And for the first time that evening, the certainty in her voice disappeared completely. The words spoken from the edge of the crowd did not disappear into the night air. Instead, they spread across the upper deck like a ripple across still water. "Is that Marcus Ellington?" The question hung there, quiet but powerful enough to pull every pair of eyes toward the man who had asked it. He stepped forward slowly through the cluster of guests, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit as he moved closer. The deck lights caught his face clearly now, revealing a man in his mid-50s with the confident posture of someone accustomed to boardrooms and investor meetings. Several guests recognized him immediately. Jonathan Pierce, managing partner at Pierce Atlantic Capital. A man who did not ask questions lightly. Jonathan stopped a few feet from Marcus and studied him carefully for a moment longer. The crowd waited. Even the gentle splash of water against the hull seemed quieter than before. Then Jonathan nodded once, the certainty in his voice leaving no room for doubt. "It is him." The statement moved through the guests like a small electric current. Several people in the circle immediately shifted their stance. A woman near the bar lowered her phone slowly, whispering to the man beside her that Marcus Ellington had recently been featured on the cover of a national business magazine after leading one of the largest marina redevelopment deals in the southeastern United States. Another guest murmured that Ellington Ventures had expanded rapidly during the past 5 years, acquiring coastal properties and luxury charter fleets across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Chloe Whitman felt the temperature of the entire deck change without the breeze even shifting. Her eyes moved quickly from Jonathan Pierce back to Marcus. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain about what she was seeing. "That cannot be correct," she said quietly, though the firmness she had relied on earlier was noticeably weaker. Jonathan looked at her with a mixture of confusion and mild disbelief. "Chloe, that is Marcus Ellington," he repeated. "I met him at a maritime investment conference last spring." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Chloe glanced around the deck and noticed something that had not been there earlier. The guests were no longer watching Marcus with curiosity. They were watching her. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing from the beginning, one hand resting lightly on the polished railing while the harbor lights shimmered behind him. His posture had not changed. His expression had not changed. He did not look triumphant. He did not look offended. He simply looked patient. That patience made the moment feel even more uncomfortable for Chloe. "If that is the case," she said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across uncertain ground, "then there must have been a miscommunication." A few people in the crowd exchanged quiet glances at that phrase. Miscommunication. It was a polite way of describing a situation that had unfolded very publicly only moments earlier. Jonathan Pierce folded his arms and looked toward Marcus again. "Marcus," he said with a small smile, "I was wondering when you might arrive tonight." Marcus nodded politely. "Good evening, Jonathan." The calm exchange between the two men carried the unmistakable tone of professional familiarity. Several guests noticed it immediately. Chloe felt the realization settle deeper in her chest. The stranger she had confronted was not simply an unexpected guest. He was someone that other guests on the yacht clearly recognized and respected. The circle around them tightened slightly as more people stepped closer to hear what would happen next. One young entrepreneur near the staircase whispered to his friend that the situation was quickly becoming a lesson in how quickly assumptions can unravel. Chloe cleared her throat and attempted to reassemble the authority that had guided her earlier in the evening. "Mr. Ellington," she said, adjusting her grip on the clipboard, "if you had identified yourself when you first arrived, this misunderstanding could have been avoided." Marcus looked at her with the same calm curiosity he had shown before. "Could it?" The simple question landed gently but firmly. Chloe hesitated. "Yes," she said after a moment. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. "Interesting," he replied. Jonathan Pierce watched the exchange carefully. "What happened exactly?" he asked. Several guests immediately leaned closer. Chloe spoke quickly, eager to explain the situation before the narrative formed without her. "Mr. Ellington arrived without checking in through the guest list," she said. "I asked him to leave because I believed he was not registered for the event." Jonathan glanced briefly at Marcus. "Did you ask him for his name?" Chloe paused. That question had not occurred to her earlier. The silence that followed stretched longer than anyone expected. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Marcus answered the question himself, his tone steady and quiet. She did not. Jonathan looked back toward Chloe slowly. The look was not angry. It was worse than that. It was disappointed. "Chloe," he said carefully, "Marcus Ellington is the founder of the company that now manages half of the marina development surrounding this harbor." The statement carried across the deck clearly enough that several guests near the back repeated the information quietly to those who had not heard it the first time. Chloe's grip on the clipboard tightened slightly. The edges of the paper pressed into her fingers. "I was not informed of that detail," she said. Marcus nodded gently. "That is understandable." Chloe looked up at him, surprised by the absence of accusation in his voice. Marcus continued speaking calmly. "The acquisition was finalized recently. The paperwork was completed less than 3 weeks ago." A guest near the railing whispered that the deal had been valued at nearly $180 million. Another guest quietly said that Ellington Ventures had been expanding aggressively into luxury marine properties during the past year. Chloe heard the whispers and felt the ground beneath her confidence continue to shift. She glanced again toward the gangway where the security staff member still stood watching carefully, uncertain whether he should intervene or remain still. Marcus followed her gaze briefly, then looked back toward the circle of guests. "It is a beautiful evening for a gathering like this," he said. The comment sounded almost conversational, as if the previous tension had been a minor interruption rather than the focus of everyone's attention. Jonathan chuckled softly. "It usually is." The two men shared a brief nod of understanding. Chloe noticed it and realized that the conversation had already begun moving beyond her control. "Mr. Ellington," she said carefully, "if you would like, I can check again with the host and confirm your invitation." Marcus considered the suggestion for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "I do not believe that will be necessary." Chloe frowned slightly. "Why not?" Marcus gestured lightly toward the yacht around them, the glowing deck lights, the silent guests, the harbor stretching beyond the marina docks. "Because the host already knows I am here." Almost as if summoned by the statement, another voice suddenly echoed from the staircase leading up from the lower deck. "Marcus." The name cut through the quiet conversations immediately. The crowd turned again toward the new arrival. A tall man in a tailored navy jacket was making his way up the steps, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition as he reached the top of the deck. Several guests stepped aside to clear a path for him. Daniel Crawford, the host of the evening. His eyes moved quickly from Marcus to Chloe, and then across the circle of guests who had gathered around them. "What is going on here?" he asked. Chloe felt the weight of every pair of eyes shift toward her again. For the first time since the confrontation began, she was not entirely sure how to answer that question. Daniel Crawford stepped onto the upper deck, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than the ocean air drifting across the harbor. The host of the evening stopped halfway between the staircase and the circle of guests, his eyes moving slowly from face to face until they finally settled on Marcus Ellington standing near the polished railing. For a moment Daniel said nothing. His expression changed from confusion to recognition so quickly that several people watching noticed it immediately. The tension that had been building for the past several minutes shifted again, this time in a way that no one could ignore. Daniel exhaled softly and stepped forward with a small shake of his head. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the deck, "I did not realize you had already arrived." The crowd reacted before anyone spoke. Several guests exchanged glances while others quietly lowered their phones, realizing that the moment they had been recording had just taken a very different turn. Chloe Whitman felt the words strike harder than any accusation could have. Her eyes moved quickly from Daniel to Marcus and back again, the certainty she had been clinging to throughout the evening dissolving in front of everyone watching. Marcus nodded politely. "Good evening, Daniel." The calm tone in his voice made the entire exchange feel strangely ordinary, as if two colleagues had simply run into each other at a business reception rather than in the center of a growing confrontation. Daniel walked the remaining few steps toward him and extended his hand without hesitation. Marcus accepted the handshake with the same steady composure he had maintained from the beginning. The gesture alone was enough to confirm what several people in the crowd had already begun to suspect. Daniel turned slightly toward the guests and smiled with the ease of a host used to managing rooms filled with powerful personalities. "Everyone," he said, gesturing lightly toward Marcus. "This is Marcus Ellington from Ellington Ventures." The name spread across the deck instantly. Some guests already knew it. Others recognized it from recent headlines about the marina redevelopment deal that had reshaped large sections of the coastal business district. A quiet murmur moved through the group as people processed the reality of what had been unfolding in front of them for the past several minutes. Chloe stood perfectly still, the clipboard in her hand suddenly feeling heavier than it had earlier in the evening. Daniel glanced toward her, then back at Marcus, sensing the lingering tension in the air. "Is everything all right here?" he asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the harbor where the reflections of distant skyscrapers shimmered across the dark water. The moment stretched just long enough for everyone nearby to realize that the question carried more weight than it appeared. Finally, Marcus turned back toward Daniel with the same calm expression. "There was a small misunderstanding," he said. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "What kind of misunderstanding?" The crowd waited again. Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, unsure whether speaking first would make the situation worse or better. Marcus glanced briefly in her direction before answering the host. Your event manager believed I was not on the guest list. The words were delivered without anger, without accusation, simply as a statement of fact. Daniel's expression shifted slowly as he processed the information. He looked toward Chloe, then at the clipboard in her hand, then back toward Marcus. You were asked to leave? He asked carefully. Marcus shrugged lightly. Something close to that. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jonathan Pierce stepped slightly closer, his voice calm but direct. Daniel. Chloe attempted to remove him from the yacht. Daniel's attention snapped fully toward Chloe now. The silence on the deck deepened again. For a moment, Chloe seemed unable to find the right words. Her confidence from earlier in the evening had been built on the assumption that she understood exactly who belonged on that yacht and who did not. That assumption had just collapsed in front of dozens of influential guests and several raised cameras. I believed he was not registered, she said finally, her voice noticeably quieter than before. Daniel studied her for a moment, then looked back toward Marcus. Marcus, you know you never need to check in at one of my events, he said with a small smile that attempted to lighten the tension. Marcus returned the smile politely. I suspected as much. The surrounding guests released a small wave of nervous laughter. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck briefly, clearly aware that the evening had taken an awkward turn. Well, he said, clapping his hands once in an attempt to reset the atmosphere. It appears we have had a very unfortunate introduction tonight. Marcus nodded slowly. Introductions can be revealing. The comment was gentle but unmistakably pointed. Chloe heard it and felt the heat of embarrassment rise across her face. Daniel followed Marcus's glance toward her, and the weight of the situation finally settled fully into his expression. Chloe, he said carefully, did you ask him for his name? The question echoed across the deck with uncomfortable clarity. Chloe hesitated again. No, she admitted quietly. A few guests near the back exchanged knowing looks. Daniel sighed softly. You should have. Marcus remained silent during the exchange, watching the harbor lights beyond the railing as if the conversation unfolding around him was simply another part of the evening. The calm in his demeanor made the contrast even sharper. Daniel looked back toward him with an apologetic expression. Marcus, I am very sorry about this. Marcus shook his head slightly. No harm done. The simplicity of the response surprised several people in the crowd. Many had expected frustration or anger after such a public misunderstanding. Instead, Marcus sounded almost reflective. Daniel glanced again toward Chloe, then back toward Marcus. Still, he continued, that should not have happened. The ocean breeze moved across the deck again, carrying the distant sound of boat engines drifting through the marina. Several guests stepped slightly closer, sensing that the conversation was not quite finished. Marcus folded his hands lightly in front of him and looked toward Daniel with a thoughtful expression. Daniel, he said calmly, can I ask you something? Daniel nodded immediately. Of course. Marcus gestured lightly toward the surrounding harbor where rows of luxury vessels were docked beneath the glowing marina lights. When we finalized the partnership 3 weeks ago, Marcus said, we discussed how this marina would represent a new chapter for both of our companies. Daniel nodded again. That is correct. Marcus's gaze returned to Chloe for a brief moment before settling back on Daniel. Partnerships depend on trust, he continued. And trust depends on the people who represent the businesses involved. The guests listening understood immediately what Marcus was implying. Daniel understood as well. The host's expression grew more serious as he looked toward Chloe again. The weight of the situation now rested squarely on the deck between them. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, the evening's power dynamic had completely reversed. The quiet man who had been asked to leave the yacht only minutes earlier now stood beside the host while the rest of the guests watched to see how the situation would be resolved. The silence that followed Marcus Ellington's words did not fade quickly. Instead, it stretched across the upper deck like a held breath, lingering between the glow of the marina lights and the quiet movement of the water below the hull. Daniel Crawford stood beside him with a thoughtful expression, the meaning behind Marcus's statement about trust clearly settling into place. Around them, the gathered guests shifted slightly, some lowering their phones now that the confrontation had transformed into something more serious than spectacle. The ocean breeze brushed across the deck again, moving the linen napkins on the cocktail tables and carrying the distant sound of boat horns from the harbor entrance nearly a quarter-mile away. Daniel glanced toward Chloe Whitman. For several seconds he did not speak. The pause itself was enough to make the tension visible. Chloe felt every pair of eyes on the deck resting on her now. Only minutes earlier she had been the person directing the evening, greeting investors, guiding guests to the bar, making sure the event moved smoothly. Now she stood in the center of the same, gathering feeling as if the ground beneath her role had quietly shifted. Daniel finally exhaled and spoke carefully. "Chloe," he said, "I think we need to talk about what happened." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The seriousness in it carried across the deck more clearly than any raised tone could have. Chloe straightened slightly, trying to recover the composure that had guided her through dozens of corporate events before this one. "I followed the guest list that was provided to me," she said. Mr. Ellington was not listed. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but not accepting it as the complete explanation. "The guest list is a reference," he replied calmly. "It is not a final authority." A few guests near the bar quietly nodded. In agreement. In events like this, certain names never needed to appear on a printed list. Chloe glanced briefly toward Marcus, who remained near the railing, his posture relaxed, his attention drifting again toward the harbor lights. He looked less like someone involved in a confrontation and more like a guest enjoying the evening air. That contrast only deepened the discomfort of the moment. Daniel continued speaking, his tone measured. "Marcus Ellington is not simply a guest tonight," he said. "His company is a major partner in the marina development surrounding this harbor." Several guests murmured quietly again, repeating the information to those who had not heard earlier conversations. Chloe felt the weight of those words settle further across the deck. She had known the marina project involved multiple investors and corporate partners, but she had not memorized every name connected to the deal. The scale of Ellington Ventures' role had never been fully explained to her before the event. She looked down briefly at the clipboard still in her hand. The printed pages suddenly seemed like a poor defense against what had just unfolded. Marcus noticed the movement and spoke for the first time since Daniel had begun addressing the situation. "Daniel," he said calmly, "I do not believe she intended to cause a problem." Chloe looked up in surprise. The statement had not sounded sarcastic. It sounded sincere. Daniel glanced at Marcus, slightly puzzled. "Perhaps not," he said. "But intent does not erase the situation." Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. The surrounding guests remained silent, listening closely. Several of them had shifted from curiosity to thoughtful attention. The moment had become less about embarrassment and more about what would happen next. Daniel turned again toward Chloe. "When someone arrives at an event like this," he continued, "the first step is not to assume they do not belong." Chloe's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but she hesitated again. Daniel continued, his tone still calm, but unmistakably firm. "The first step is to ask their name." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation could have. A few guests nodded quietly. Chloe felt the realization settle deeper. She had relied on the guest list and her own assumptions instead of asking a simple question that could have prevented the entire situation. Marcus watched the exchange quietly. The deck lights reflected softly across the water behind him, while the skyline shimmered in the distance. Finally he spoke again, his voice even and composed. "It is an easy mistake to make," he said. Chloe looked at him with a mixture of relief and lingering embarrassment. "I appreciate your understanding," she said quietly. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Understanding does not mean ignoring the lesson." The words were gentle but unmistakably clear. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. "Marcus is right," he said. "Moments like this reveal how quickly assumptions can shape decisions." The guests around them listened carefully. The atmosphere had shifted once more, from tension to reflection. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward slightly, speaking with the relaxed tone of someone accustomed to corporate negotiations. "Daniel," he said, "to be fair, events like this move quickly. Mistakes happen." Daniel nodded. "They do," he agreed. "But how we respond to them matters more." Chloe took a slow breath, gathering the composure she had been trying to reclaim. "Mr. Ellington," she said, addressing Marcus directly now, "I should have asked your name before making any decision. That was my responsibility." Marcus studied her expression for a moment. The embarrassment in her voice was genuine. He nodded once in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said simply. The response surprised several guests again. There was no triumph in his tone, no attempt to extend the moment, just acknowledgement. Daniel looked around the deck at the gathered crowd and clapped his hands once lightly. "All right," he said with a small smile, attempting to reset the atmosphere. "Let us remember that this evening is meant to bring people together, not divide them." The tension in the air softened slightly. A few guests laughed quietly and began returning toward the bar area. The saxophone player near the stage lifted his instrument again, letting a slow melody drift back into the night air. The yacht gently rocked against the dock as the breeze continued across the harbor. Daniel turned back toward Marcus with a welcoming gesture. "Marcus, I would like to properly introduce you to several investors who have been asking about the marina partnership." Marcus nodded politely. "That would be fine." As Daniel began guiding him toward the center of the deck, the power dynamic of the evening had completely reversed from where it had started. Only minutes earlier Marcus had been standing alone near the railing while others questioned his presence. Now the host of the event was personally escorting him into the center of the gathering. Chloe remained where she was for a moment longer, watching the shift unfold. The lesson of the evening had already settled deeply, and the quiet confidence Marcus had carried through the entire situation was something she would not forget anytime soon. The music slowly returned to the upper deck as the saxophone released a smooth, steady melody that drifted over the harbor like warm air across glass. Conversations began again in small pockets around the yacht, but the energy of the evening had changed. The guests who had witnessed the confrontation only minutes earlier were not speaking about startup valuations or investment rounds anymore. They were quietly discussing the moment they had just seen unfold. Daniel Crawford walked beside Marcus Ellington toward the center lounge area of the yacht, where a semicircle of white leather seating overlooked the water. The polished teak deck reflected the soft golden lights mounted along the railing, and beyond them the Miami skyline glowed nearly a mile away across the dark bay. Daniel lifted 2 glasses of sparkling water from a nearby tray and handed one to Marcus. "I am glad you came tonight," he said quietly. Marcus accepted the glass with a polite nod. "I told you I would." Daniel smiled faintly. "You did." Around them several guests began approaching, drawn by curiosity and the quiet recognition that Marcus Ellington was now the most interesting person on the yacht. Jonathan Pierce arrived first, still wearing the thoughtful expression of someone who had been analyzing the entire situation from the beginning. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand again. "I do not believe we have spoken since the Savannah Port Conference." Marcus shook his hand calmly. "That was nearly a year ago." Jonathan nodded. "You presented the expansion plan for coastal logistics infrastructure." Marcus smiled slightly. "I remember." A few other guests gathered nearby, forming a small circle that felt less like a party conversation and more like an impromptu boardroom discussion under open sky. Daniel gestured toward the harbor lights. "Marcus has been leading the redevelopment partnership for the marina project we discussed earlier tonight," he told the group. A man in a navy blazer leaned forward with interest. "The Ellington Ventures Coastal Network." Marcus nodded once. "Yes." The man let out a quiet whistle. "That deal reshaped 3 major ports along the Atlantic corridor." Another guest added softly that the expansion was expected to bring hundreds of new jobs to the region over the next few years. Marcus listened politely, but his attention occasionally drifted back toward the far side of the deck, where Chloe Whitman still stood near the entrance staircase. She had moved slightly away from the center of the gathering, speaking quietly with one of the security staff members while holding her clipboard close against her chest. The embarrassment from earlier had not disappeared from her posture. Daniel noticed Marcus glance in that direction and spoke quietly. "You handled that situation with more patience than most people would have." Marcus took a slow sip of water before answering. "Moments like that are not new to me." Jonathan Pierce looked up with interest. "You mean situations where people underestimate you?" Marcus gave a small, reflective smile. "Something like that." The group around them fell quiet again. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of the leather seat beside him and looked out toward the water as if the reflection of the skyline carried memories older than the conversation happening around him. "When I was younger," he said slowly, "I once tried to attend a business reception at a coastal development conference in Charleston." The guests leaned closer without realizing it. Marcus continued speaking calmly. I had just started my first company. I had driven nearly 600 miles overnight to attend the event. The breeze lifted slightly across the deck as he spoke. When I arrived at the hotel ballroom, the person at the door looked at me and told me the event was private. Daniel frowned slightly. Even after you told them you were invited? Marcus nodded once. I showed them my printed invitation. Jonathan asked quietly, and Marcus shrugged gently. They told me the invitation must have been sent by mistake. The small circle of guests exchanged glances. Daniel's expression darkened slightly as he understood the implication behind the story. Marcus continued in the same calm tone. I could have argued with them. I could have demanded that they verify my name. Instead, I simply walked away. One of the guests asked softly, "What happened after that?" Marcus looked toward the skyline again. 5 years later, my company purchased the development rights to the entire marina district where that hotel now operates. The group let out a quiet laugh, though the humor carried a deeper recognition beneath it. Daniel shook his head slowly. That is quite a response. Marcus smiled slightly. Success can be very persuasive. The conversation paused again. The saxophone music floated gently across the deck, while a server passed nearby, offering trays of appetizers. Marcus politely declined. Daniel glanced once more toward the staircase where Chloe remained standing. She had finished speaking with the security staff member and was now watching the gathering from a distance. Daniel sighed softly. I should speak with her privately later, he said. Marcus shook his head lightly. That is your decision. Daniel looked at him carefully. But you believe something should be addressed. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the empty glass back onto the tray as the server passed again. Then he spoke quietly enough that only the people closest to him could hear. Every business partnership is built on culture as much as contracts. Jonathan Pierce nodded slowly in agreement. Marcus continued. When people represent a company, their assumptions shape the environment around them. Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. You were saying that what happened tonight was not only about a guest list. Marcus met his eyes. Exactly. The group fell silent again as the meaning settled in. Several of the nearby guests who had been listening began to understand that the evening's lesson extended far beyond a single misunderstanding. Daniel finally nodded. I understand. The host turned toward the surrounding guests and lifted his glass with a welcoming gesture. Ladies and gentlemen, he said with renewed energy, let us continue the evening. Tonight we celebrate partnerships that will shape the future of this harbor. The crowd responded with a warm round of applause. As the conversations restarted and the music rose slightly in volume, Marcus Ellington remained standing near the center of the deck, calm and composed. Only a few minutes earlier he had been standing alone near the railing while someone questioned whether he belonged on the yacht at all. Now the same guests were gathering around him with interest and respect. And across the deck, Chloe Whitman quietly realized that the evening she had expected to manage smoothly had turned into a lesson she would remember for the rest of her career. The music carried across the yacht once more, smoother now, but the quiet gravity of the evening had not disappeared. Guests moved through the upper deck with glasses in hand, small conversations forming beneath the warm glow of the deck lights. Yet many of those conversations kept drifting back toward the same name. Marcus Ellington. The man who only minutes earlier had been standing alone near the railing was now surrounded by investors, founders, and maritime executives eager to speak with him. Daniel Crawford stood beside him, occasionally introducing him to new arrivals who had just boarded from the marina dock 30 yards away. The harbor stretched out in front of them like a field of scattered stars, reflections of skyscraper windows rippling across the dark water as yachts gently rocked against their moorings. Marcus listened patiently as a young venture partner described a logistics startup looking for expansion capital along the eastern seaboard. He nodded politely and offered a few thoughtful comments, but his calm demeanor made it clear that he was not trying to dominate the conversation. The confidence he carried did not require attention. It simply existed. Across the deck, Chloe Whitman remained near the entrance area, still holding her clipboard though she was no longer checking names. The crowd had shifted enough that no one needed a gatekeeper anymore. Her eyes occasionally drifted toward the group gathered around Marcus, and each time she did, the memory of the confrontation earlier in the evening replayed in quiet fragments. She remembered the moment she had stepped in front of him and told him the party was not for people like him. At the time the words had felt routine, almost mechanical, part of managing a private guest list. Now they sounded different in her mind, heavier than she had realized when she spoke them. A server walked past her carrying a tray of drinks, and she accepted a glass of sparkling water without thinking. The cold condensation on the glass felt grounding in her hand. Daniel finished another introduction and turned slightly toward Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said quietly, "when you first told me you planned to expand Ellington Ventures into coastal infrastructure, I assumed you meant shipping routes and cargo terminals." Marcus smiled faintly. "That was the beginning." Daniel nodded toward the marina lights surrounding them. "But this," he continued, gesturing to the rows of yachts and the wide harbor beyond, "this scale happened much faster than I expected." Marcus looked across. The water again. Opportunities move quickly when people are willing to see them. Jonathan Pierce joined the conversation once more, holding a glass of mineral water. "Your timing with the marina redevelopment deal surprised nearly every analyst on the East Coast," he said. "Most investors believed the project would take another decade to reach that level of funding." Marcus rested one hand lightly against the polished teak railing. "Sometimes the right partners accelerate the timeline." Daniel chuckled quietly. "I suppose I should take that as a compliment." Marcus glanced toward him and nodded once. "You should." The surrounding guests laughed softly. The easy exchange between the two men carried the relaxed tone of professionals who respected each other's judgment. Several people in the circle began asking Marcus about the future of coastal transportation, about environmental infrastructure, about the growth of luxury charter networks along the Atlantic. Marcus answered each question calmly, never rushing, never exaggerating. His voice carried a steady rhythm that made even complex financial plans sound almost conversational. As the discussion continued, Daniel noticed something that had not been obvious earlier. Marcus never spoke about power directly. He spoke about systems, partnerships, patience, and long-term strategy. The authority that surrounded him came from those ideas rather than from the wealth that followed them. Daniel leaned closer slightly and lowered his voice. "Earlier tonight," he said, "you mentioned that moments like that are not new to you." Marcus understood the reference immediately. He watched a boat glide slowly across the harbor, nearly 200 yards away before answering. "No," he said quietly. "They are not." Jonathan glanced between them with interest. "Do they still surprise you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Not anymore," he replied. The breeze shifted again, lifting the corner of a nearby tablecloth. Marcus continued speaking slowly, the reflection of the skyline moving across the water behind him. "People often build expectations based on what they see in front of them." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Clothes, introductions, reputation." Marcus agreed. "Exactly." Daniel crossed his arms lightly. "But you never seem angry about it." Marcus looked at him with a calm expression. Anger rarely improves a situation. The answer carried the kind of quiet wisdom that only comes from experience. Several of the guests nearby fell silent again, absorbing the words. Across the deck, Chloe watched the group from a distance. She could not hear every word, but the tone of the conversation was clear enough. Marcus Ellington was not speaking like someone who had been embarrassed earlier that evening. He was speaking like someone who had moved far beyond the moment already. That realization settled deeply in her mind. Daniel finally gestured toward the center of the deck, where the small stage had been set up for the evening's announcement about the marina partnership. "Marcus," he said, "I had planned to make a short presentation later tonight about the next phase of development along this harbor." Marcus looked toward the stage area. "Yes." Daniel smiled slightly. "I think it would mean more if you spoke about it yourself." The nearby guests immediately leaned closer, interested in hearing what Marcus might say. Jonathan chuckled quietly. Now that would certainly change the atmosphere of the evening. Marcus considered the suggestion for a moment. The harbor lights reflected in his eyes as he looked across the deck at the gathered guests, at the quiet excitement building in the conversations around them, and briefly toward the far side of the yacht, where Chloe Whitman still stood near the entrance. Finally he nodded. "Very well," he said calmly. Daniel clapped his hands once to get the attention of the guests scattered across the deck. Conversations gradually softened until the only sound left was the gentle saxophone melody fading into the background. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced, "before we continue enjoying this beautiful Miami evening, I would like to introduce someone who has played a significant role in shaping the future of this harbor." The crowd turned toward the small stage area. Marcus stepped forward slowly, his calm presence drawing the attention of every guest on the yacht. Only an hour earlier, many of them had not known his name. Now the entire deck waited quietly to hear what he would say next. The deck fell into a calm, attentive silence as Marcus Ellington stepped onto the small stage near the center of the yacht. The soft lights mounted along the railing reflected gently off the polished wood beneath his feet, while the skyline of Miami shimmered nearly a mile away across the dark water. Conversations faded naturally without anyone needing to ask for quiet. The guests gathered closer, forming a loose semicircle around the stage. Some leaned against the railings. Others held glasses of sparkling water or wine, and a few still carried their phones lowered at their sides. The breeze coming off the harbor carried a hint of salt and distant engine hum from passing boats. Marcus paused for a moment before speaking, his gaze moving slowly across the faces in front of him. Only an hour earlier, many of them had never seen him before. Now every person on the deck was focused on him. Daniel Crawford stood a few steps away with a relaxed expression, allowing Marcus the space to speak. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the edge of the small podium and smiled faintly. "Good evening," he said calmly. His voice carried easily across the deck without needing to rise. The natural authority in it made people lean closer rather than step back. "Daniel invited me tonight to celebrate a partnership that means a great deal to both of our companies," he continued. "But standing here now, I think it also represents something larger." Several guests nodded slightly, already curious about where his words were going. Marcus looked briefly toward the marina lights beyond the yacht, as if measuring the distance between past and present. 20 years ago, he said, this harbor looked very different. A few longtime investors in the crowd murmured quietly in agreement. Marcus continued speaking with the steady rhythm that had marked every conversation he had held earlier in the evening. "At that time, I was a young entrepreneur trying to build my first logistics company. I spent most of my days driving along the coastline meeting small shipping operators and port managers, learning how the entire network worked." He paused briefly while the breeze lifted the edge of the microphone cable resting against the podium. "One night, I came to a marina very much like this one. I had a meeting scheduled with a group of investors who were considering funding my expansion plan." The guests listened closely. Some leaned forward slightly as the story unfolded. "When I arrived," Marcus continued, "I remember standing near the entrance and looking out across the water just like this." He gestured gently toward the harbor beyond the yacht. The lights were reflecting across the surface exactly the same way. The quiet atmosphere deepened as he spoke. "But the meeting did not go the way I expected." Marcus smiled softly, not with bitterness but with reflection. "The people organizing the event assumed I was there. For the catering staff." A few guests shifted uncomfortably while others looked down at their glasses. Marcus noticed the reactions but continued without changing his calm tone. "They politely suggested that I should wait near the service entrance until someone gave me instructions." The silence across the deck grew heavier. Marcus folded his hands lightly in front of him as he continued the story. "At that moment I had two choices," he said. "I could argue with them, or I could walk away and focus on building something that would eventually speak for itself." Daniel watched him with quiet admiration. Marcus looked back across the crowd again. "I chose the second option." A few guests nodded slowly. Marcus continued. "Over the next 2 decades, Ellington Ventures expanded across the coastal logistics network, port infrastructure, and maritime transportation industry. We invested in shipyards, technology platforms, and harbor redevelopment projects along the Atlantic corridor." Jonathan Pierce folded his arms thoughtfully while listening. Marcus gestured once more toward the marina surrounding the yacht. 3 weeks ago, our company finalized a partnership with Daniel and his team to help reshape this entire harbor district into one of the most advanced coastal development hubs in the United States." The guests responded with quiet murmurs of approval. Marcus paused again, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before continuing. "But the reason I share that story tonight is not about business success," he said. "It is about perspective." The breeze moved across the deck again, carrying the distant sound of a boat horn nearly half a mile away across the bay. Marcus's voice remained steady. "Opportunities do not always arrive with introductions," he said. "Sometimes they arrive quietly, standing near a doorway, waiting to see whether someone will ask a simple question before making a decision. Several people in the crowd exchanged thoughtful glances. The message was clear without Marcus needing to explain it directly. Marcus smiled faintly. I have learned that the most valuable skill in business is not predicting markets or negotiating contracts. He paused briefly. It is recognizing people. The guests listened carefully as he continued. Because the person standing in front of you might one day build the very project you are celebrating. Daniel chuckled quietly, and several guests laughed along with him. The tension from earlier in the evening had transformed into something entirely different now. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the podium again. Tonight, this harbor represents a partnership between many people who believe in long-term vision, he said. Investors, engineers, city planners, and entrepreneurs who are willing to build something that will serve this coastline for generations. The lights of the marina shimmered across the water behind him. Marcus glanced briefly toward the far side of the deck, where Chloe Whitman stood among the other event staff. She lowered her eyes for a moment, recognizing the quiet lesson woven into his words. Marcus returned his attention to the crowd. Progress happens when people choose curiosity instead of assumption, he said, and when they choose conversation instead of judgment. The guests began nodding more openly now. Several lifted their glasses slightly in agreement. Marcus concluded with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. Daniel and I believe this harbor will become a gateway for innovation along the Atlantic coast, he said, and we are grateful to share that vision with all of you tonight. The deck filled with warm applause as he stepped back from the podium. Daniel approached him with a smile and extended his hand again. The music began to rise softly once more as the celebration continued, but everyone who had heard Marcus Ellington speak understood that the evening had already delivered a lesson far more powerful than any formal announcement. The applause lingered across the deck even after Marcus Ellington stepped away from the podium. The sound rolled gently over the water and faded into the soft music that had begun again near the lounge area. Several guests moved closer to the stage, eager to speak with him, while others remained where they stood, quietly reflecting on the words they had just heard. The night air was warm, nearly 78 degrees, and the breeze drifting across the harbor carried the faint scent of salt water and polished teak from the surrounding yachts. Daniel Crawford stood beside Marcus with a satisfied expression. That, he said quietly, was not exactly the presentation I had planned, but I think it was better. Marcus smiled faintly. Sometimes the best message is the one that happens naturally. Daniel nodded and gestured toward the group of investors approaching from the far side of the deck. You may want to prepare yourself. Half the people here will want to talk with you tonight. Marcus glanced toward the gathering crowd and laughed softly. That tends to happen when someone mentions harbor redevelopment. The two men stepped down from the stage and into the flow of the evening once again. Guests greeted Marcus with handshakes and polite introductions, many of them expressing admiration for the scale of the marina partnership that had just been described. Jonathan Pierce joined them again, lifting his glass slightly in a quiet toast. You managed to turn a difficult moment into a lesson for the entire room, he said. Marcus shrugged lightly. Lessons are more effective when people see them for themselves. Nearby, a small group of younger entrepreneurs listened with interest, clearly inspired by the calm confidence Marcus had shown throughout the evening. One of them asked about the future of coastal transportation technology. Marcus answered patiently, describing how modern ports were integrating digital logistics systems, sustainable fuel infrastructure, and automated cargo tracking networks that could transform maritime commerce across the entire Atlantic corridor. His explanations were clear and measured, never rushed, never exaggerated. As the conversations continued, the atmosphere on the yacht gradually returned to the relaxed energy of a celebration. Laughter drifted across the deck. Glasses clinked softly. The saxophone melody blended with the distant sounds of the harbor. Yet the earlier moment had left a quiet imprint on nearly everyone present. Across the deck, Chloe Whitman stood near the entrance once again, though she was no longer checking a guest list. The clipboard had been placed on a small side table beside her. Instead, she watched the flow of the event with a different awareness than before. She had spent years managing corporate gatherings like this one, making quick judgments about who belonged in certain spaces and who did not. Tonight had shown her how fragile those assumptions could be. After a few minutes, she took a slow breath and began walking toward the center of the deck, where Marcus was speaking with Daniel and several investors. Each step felt deliberate. She knew many guests were still aware of what had happened earlier. The last thing she wanted was to draw more attention to the moment. But she also understood that avoiding it would only make the discomfort linger longer. When she reached the edge of the group, she waited quietly until the conversation paused. Daniel noticed her first. "Chloe," he said gently. The small circle of guests shifted slightly. To make room, Marcus turned toward her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire evening. Chloe held her hands loosely in front of her and spoke carefully. "Mr. Ellington," she said, "may I have a moment?" Marcus nodded. "Of course." The nearby guests respectfully stepped back a few feet, giving them space without completely leaving the area. Chloe met Marcus's eyes and spoke with sincerity. "Earlier tonight, I made an assumption that should never have happened," she said. "I judged the situation without asking a simple question that would have given me the information I needed." Marcus listened quietly. Chloe continued, "I want to apologize for the way I approached you. It did not reflect the professionalism that events like this deserve." The breeze moved across the deck again, lifting a strand of her hair as she finished speaking. Marcus considered her words for a moment before answering. "Thank you for saying that," he replied calmly. Chloe nodded slightly, relieved by the absence of tension in his voice. "Your speech made something very clear," she added. "The way we see people shapes the decisions we make." Marcus gave a small, thoughtful smile. "That is true in every industry." Daniel folded his arms nearby, observing the exchange with quiet approval. Chloe glanced briefly at the harbor lights beyond the railing and then back at Marcus. "I will remember that," she said. Marcus nodded once. Then the evening served its purpose. The simplicity of the response seemed to lift the last trace of awkwardness from the moment. Chloe offered a small, grateful smile before stepping back toward her duties, this time with a different perspective guiding her attention. Daniel looked at Marcus and chuckled softly. "You handle people with the patience of a teacher." Marcus leaned lightly against the railing again. "People learn faster when they feel respected." Jonathan Pierce raised his glass once more. "And tonight nearly everyone on this yacht learned something." The group laughed quietly in agreement. Around them the celebration continued as the yacht gently rocked against the dock, lights shimmering across the calm water of the harbor. Investors discussed new partnerships. Entrepreneurs exchanged ideas. The music carried across the night air. But beneath the elegant setting and polished conversations, one truth had quietly reshaped the entire evening. A man who had been told he did not belong on the yacht had become the voice guiding its future. And the lesson he left behind traveled far beyond the marina lights, reminding everyone present that dignity, patience, and quiet confidence could reveal more power than any introduction ever could. The evening continued to unfold across the deck with the smooth rhythm of quiet conversations and soft music drifting through the warm harbor air. The tension that had once gripped the yacht earlier that night had transformed into something almost reflective. Guests moved between the lounge seating and the railing overlooking the water, discussing investment ideas, technology ventures, and the future of the marina development. The city skyline glowed in the distance, its reflection stretching across the calm surface of the bay like a scattered ribbon of light. Marcus Ellington stood near the center of the deck speaking with a group of infrastructure investors who had flown in from New York and Atlanta earlier that afternoon. Their questions focused on long-term logistics networks, coastal sustainability projects, and the potential impact of modern maritime automation systems. Marcus answered each question with the same steady clarity he had shown throughout the evening. His voice never rose above a calm conversational tone, yet people leaned closer whenever he spoke, drawn by the thoughtful precision behind every explanation. Daniel Crawford watched the scene from a few steps away with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The event he had planned as a networking celebration had turned into something deeper, something that would likely be remembered by nearly every guest on the yacht long after the evening ended. Jonathan Pierce approached him and nodded toward Marcus. "You were right about inviting him," Jonathan said. "Half the investors on this deck will want to partner with Ellington Ventures after tonight." Daniel smiled slightly. "Marcus does not try to impress people," he replied. "He simply shows them what patience and long-term thinking look like." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "And tonight he showed something else as well." Daniel glanced toward him. What is that? Jonathan looked across the deck where several younger entrepreneurs were listening carefully to Marcus describe the evolution of modern port infrastructure. How leadership looks when someone chooses dignity instead of anger. Daniel followed his gaze and understood immediately. Across the deck, Chloe Whitman had resumed coordinating the event's staff, though her approach had changed noticeably. Instead of relying on quick assumptions, she now greeted each guest personally, asking names and offering assistance with a quiet attentiveness that had not been present earlier. The moment from the beginning of the evening had clearly reshaped her perspective. After a few minutes, Marcus finished answering another question about the environmental impact of harbor redevelopment and stepped away from the group to take a brief walk along the railing. The breeze across the water felt cooler now as the night deepened, perhaps 74 degrees, carrying the distant sound of waves brushing gently against the dock pilings. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the polished rail and looked out across the harbor. The skyline lights shimmered across the bay while a large yacht passed slowly in the distance, its deck glowing softly against the dark water. For a moment he allowed himself to enjoy the quiet. The evening had been long, but the lessons within it had unfolded exactly the way they needed to. Daniel joined him a moment later, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He offered one to Marcus. "You look like someone who finally has a moment to breathe," Daniel said. Marcus smiled faintly as he accepted the glass. "Just taking in the view." Daniel leaned against the railing beside him. "When we started discussing this marina partnership, I imagined a night like this would happen eventually," he said. "But I did not expect it to carry such a powerful message." Marcus took a slow sip of water before answering. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen without anyone planning them." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. For a few seconds, the 2 men simply watched the harbor lights ripple across the water. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "You know, when Chloe first told me there had been a misunderstanding earlier tonight, I was concerned it might damage the atmosphere of the entire event." Marcus shook his head slightly. "Moments like that do not damage a room," he said. "They reveal it." Daniel glanced toward him with curiosity. "Reveal it?" Marcus nodded once. "You learn a great deal about people when assumptions are challenged." Daniel considered the thought carefully. "That is true." A few yards away, several guests were still discussing Marcus's speech from earlier. One of them repeated the line about recognizing people instead of judging them. Another guest commented that the story about the Charleston reception had changed the way he would approach future business meetings. Marcus overheard the conversation and smiled quietly. "Daniel, noticed. Your words traveled farther than you expected," he said. Marcus shrugged lightly. "People are always listening." At that moment, Chloe approached them again, this time with a composed confidence that reflected the change in her perspective. "Daniel," she said, "the final group of guests from the dock has arrived, and the catering team is preparing the dessert service." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Chloe turned toward Marcus and offered a small, respectful smile. "Mr. Ellington, several investors asked whether you would be available for a brief conversation near the lounge area when you have time." Marcus returned the smile politely. "I would be happy to." Chloe nodded once and stepped away again to continue coordinating the event. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking quietly. "She will never forget tonight." Marcus looked back toward the harbor lights. Most valuable lessons tend to arrive unexpectedly. Daniel laughed softly. That seems to be the theme of the evening. The 2 men remained at the railing for another moment before returning to the center of the deck, where the celebration continued. Music drifted across the yacht once more while guests exchanged ideas about new partnerships and future projects along the Atlantic coast. Yet beneath the conversations about business and innovation, there remained a shared understanding among everyone present. They had witnessed something rare that evening. Not a confrontation, not a display of power, but a quiet demonstration of how dignity, patience, and wisdom could transform a moment of misunderstanding into a lesson that reached far beyond the lights of the marina. The night deepened slowly across the marina as the celebration aboard the yacht reached a calmer rhythm. The music shifted into a softer tempo while the last waves of conversation moved through the deck like a gentle tide. Plates from the dessert service were being cleared by the catering staff, and several guests had moved toward the railing to enjoy the quiet view of the water before returning to their hotels or waiting cars along the dock nearly 40 yards away. The skyline lights continued to shimmer across the bay, reflecting in long ribbons of gold and white across the dark surface. Marcus Ellington stood once more near the polished railing where the evening had first begun for him, his posture relaxed, his attention drifting across the harbor as if the quiet movement of the water carried the memory of everything that had happened that night. Daniel Crawford approached again, holding a folded document tablet in one hand. "Marcus," he said, "before everyone leaves, I wanted to show you the preliminary draft of the harbor expansion agreement we discussed earlier this month." Marcus turned toward him with interest. Daniel opened the tablet and displayed a digital layout showing a detailed rendering of the marina district stretching nearly 2 miles along the waterfront. The plan included upgraded docking infrastructure, sustainable energy stations for electric marine vessels, and a logistics coordination hub designed to support the increasing flow of commercial and charter traffic along the Atlantic corridor. Marcus studied the screen carefully. "This section here," he said, pointing toward the southern edge of the marina map, "will require deeper water channels if we expect the new generation of vessels to dock comfortably." Daniel nodded. "Our engineering team estimated that adjustment earlier this week." Jonathan Pierce stepped closer and glanced at the display. "If that project moves forward as planned," he said, "this harbor will become one of the most advanced coastal gateways in the country." Marcus gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That is the intention." Nearby, several investors who had been speaking with Marcus earlier approached again, curious to see the design. The conversation shifted naturally toward future phases of the project, including coastal environmental safeguards, regional job growth projections, and the integration of new maritime technology platforms. Each topic flowed smoothly into the next, as if the entire evening had been quietly guiding the guests toward this moment of shared vision. Across the deck, Chloe Whitman observed the group while coordinating the final arrangements for the departing guests. The earlier embarrassment had transformed into something more productive within her. She now watched the conversations with a careful awareness of how easily assumptions could shape decisions. A server approached her and asked whether the remaining guests should be offered coffee or tea before the evening ended. Chloe smiled and nodded, thanking him before continuing her work. Daniel finished explaining another detail of the expansion plan and looked toward Marcus. "You know," he said, "tonight might have started with a misunderstanding, but it may end up strengthening this partnership even more." Marcus leaned lightly against the railing again and looked out toward the harbor lights. "Sometimes clarity arrives through uncomfortable moments," he said quietly. Jonathan Pierce chuckled softly. "That is one way to describe it." The group shared a brief laugh before returning to the discussion. Marcus then spoke again, his tone reflective rather than strategic. "What matters most is what people choose to learn from those moments." Daniel followed his gaze toward the distant lights of the city. "Tonight reminded everyone here of something important," he said. "In business, the ability to recognize potential often matters more than the ability to evaluate numbers." Marcus nodded once in agreement. Several of the nearby guests had fallen quiet again, listening carefully to the exchange. One of the younger entrepreneurs who had been present during Marcus's speech earlier stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Ellington," he said respectfully, "can I ask you something?" Marcus turned toward him. "Of course." The young man hesitated for a moment before continuing. "When people underestimate you like that, how do you stay calm?" The question drew the attention of nearly everyone standing nearby. Marcus smiled gently, recognizing the sincerity behind it. "Experience helps," he said. "But more importantly, understanding that every moment like that is temporary." The young entrepreneur nodded slowly. Marcus continued. "When someone makes a judgment too quickly, they are revealing more about their perspective than about your value." Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Marcus rested one hand on the railing again as he spoke. "If you react with anger, the situation becomes about the conflict. But if you respond with patience, the truth eventually speaks louder than the misunderstanding." Daniel smiled quietly beside him. "That seems to be exactly what happened tonight." Marcus looked around the deck once more. The music had softened even further as the final guests prepared to leave. Some were exchanging business cards, others promising to continue conversations at future meetings or conferences. The harbor breeze carried the distant hum of engines from boats returning to their docks along the waterfront. Marcus spoke again, his voice calm but clear enough for the small group to hear. "The most powerful response to doubt is not confrontation," he said. "It is consistency." Jonathan Pierce nodded thoughtfully. Consistency builds credibility. Marcus agreed. And credibility builds trust. Daniel closed the tablet in his hand and looked across the deck where the remaining guests were gathering near the exit ramp. Well, he said with a satisfied smile, I think tonight accomplished far more than I expected. Marcus chuckled softly. It usually does when people choose to listen. The final group of guests began walking down the ramp toward the dock as the yacht lights reflected across the quiet harbor. Staff members moved efficiently to prepare the vessel for departure while the soft music faded into the background. Marcus remained near the railing for a final moment, looking across the water that stretched out beneath the glowing skyline. Only hours earlier he had arrived quietly, greeted with doubt by someone who believed he did not belong. Now the same harbor stood ready to become the next chapter in the vision he had spent decades building. And for everyone who had witnessed the evening unfold, the lesson was unmistakable. True power rarely arrives with an announcement. It reveals itself through patience, clarity, and the quiet confidence to let actions speak when assumptions fail. The final guests began stepping off the yacht one by one as the evening settled into the calm quiet that only arrives after a long and meaningful gathering. The marina lights reflected across the dark water in slow shimmering patterns while the distant skyline of Miami continued to glow against the night sky. The breeze drifting across the harbor had cooled slightly, now closer to 72 degrees, carrying the gentle sound of waves touching the wooden dock beneath the yacht. Staff members moved efficiently across the deck, collecting empty glasses and folding the remaining linen table settings while the soft music near the lounge area faded into the background. Marcus Ellington remained near the railing where he had spent much of the evening, looking out across the harbor with the relaxed posture of someone who had seen moments like this many times before. The reflections of the city lights stretched across the water like long ribbons of gold and silver, and for a few seconds he simply stood there quietly, allowing the stillness to settle after the conversations and lessons that had filled the night. Daniel Crawford approached from behind him, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had just been prepared by the catering team. He handed one to Marcus with a small smile. I thought you might appreciate something warm before heading back to shore, he said. Marcus accepted the cup and nodded in appreciation. Thank you. The 2 men leaned lightly against the railing, watching the final group of guests walk down the boarding ramp toward the dock, where several black sedans waited beneath the marina. Lights nearly 50 feet away. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee before speaking again. I have hosted many events on this yacht, he said thoughtfully, but I cannot remember one that ended with such a powerful message. Marcus smiled faintly without looking away from the harbor. Sometimes the message arrives before anyone realizes a lesson is needed. Daniel nodded slowly. Earlier tonight, when Chloe told you to leave, I worried the entire evening might collapse into an uncomfortable scene. Marcus chuckled quietly. Moments like that rarely determine the outcome of an evening. Daniel looked toward him with curiosity. Then what does? Marcus lifted the coffee cup slightly, letting the warmth settle in his hands before answering. How people choose to respond. Daniel considered the answer carefully. A few feet away, Jonathan Pierce was finishing a final conversation with 2 visiting investors from Boston before walking down the ramp toward the dock. The night had grown quieter now that the crowd had thinned, and the calm atmosphere allowed every word spoken near the railing to carry easily through the open air. Marcus continued speaking in the same calm tone that had defined his presence throughout the entire evening. Years ago, I learned that assumptions are rarely about the person standing in front of you, he said. They are about the limits someone else has placed on their own understanding. Daniel nodded slowly as the meaning settled in. Marcus looked back across the harbor where another yacht was gliding quietly through the bay nearly a quarter-mile away. Tonight was not the first time someone believed I did not belong somewhere, he added. And it will probably not be the last. Daniel glanced toward him. Yet you never seemed upset. Marcus gave a small reflective smile. Anger would have distracted from the real point. Daniel asked quietly, which was? Marcus finally turned his attention back toward him. That dignity speaks louder than reaction. The 2 men shared a brief moment of understanding as the final catering staff carried trays down the ramp toward the dock. Across the deck, Chloe Whitman was overseeing the last of the cleanup tasks, speaking with the staff in a calm and organized manner. When she finished, she approached the railing once more, stopping a respectful distance away from Marcus and Daniel. The earlier tension had disappeared from her posture. Instead, there was a quiet determination in her expression. "Mr. Ellington," she said politely, "the transportation team confirmed that your driver will arrive at the dock within the next 10 minutes. Marcus nodded in appreciation. "Thank you." Chloe hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Tonight taught me something I will carry with me for the rest of my career," she said sincerely. Marcus looked at her with the same calm respect he had shown earlier. "What was that?" Chloe took a small breath before answering. "That the first question we ask someone should always be their name." Daniel smiled quietly at the response. Marcus nodded once. "That is a good place to start." Chloe returned the smile and stepped back toward the dock ramp, leaving the two men at the railing once more. The harbor had grown even quieter now. The music had stopped entirely, and the only sounds left were the gentle movement of the water and the occasional hum of an engine somewhere beyond the marina. Marcus finished the last sip of his coffee and placed the cup on a nearby tray. "This harbor will change significantly over the next few years," he said calmly. Daniel followed his gaze toward the wide stretch of waterfront buildings that lined the bay. "With Ellington Ventures involved, I have no doubt about that." Marcus rested one hand on the railing again. "Change is rarely about buildings or technology," he said. "It is about the mindset of the people guiding the process." Daniel nodded. "Then tonight was a good beginning." Marcus smiled slightly. The driver's headlights appeared along the dock road as the final preparations for departure finished behind them. Marcus stepped away from the railing and looked back across the deck one last time. Only hours earlier, he had arrived quietly, standing near the entrance while someone questioned whether he belonged on the yacht at all. Now the same space had become the stage for a lesson that reached far beyond a single evening. He turned back toward Daniel and spoke with calm certainty. "You know," he said, "people sometimes believe power needs to announce itself loudly." Daniel raised an eyebrow with curiosity. Marcus continued, "But real power does something much simpler." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "It proves itself without raising its voice." The two men walked toward the dock ramp as the harbor lights shimmered behind them, leaving the quiet yacht anchored beneath. The skyline and the memory of a night that had transformed doubt into understanding.